Okay, good afternoon. My name is Julian Nava. I'm a staff attorney with the National Congress of American Indians. I will also be your webinar administrator for today. On behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar presentation. Now, before we begin, I'd like to go over some of our webinar features. First, you should see on your screen the PowerPoint for today's presentation. You experience any lag in slide transition, it may be the result of internet connections, so just give it a few extra seconds to update on your screen. Currently, with the exception of panelists, all audio phone calls are muted until conclusion of the presentation. But if you'd like to queue up a question, you can certainly do that, and you can provide either a written question in the box provided on your panel, or you can select the raise hand function so that we can see that you have a question. Also, our webinar software archives all questions submitted through the questions box. So if we're unable to answer or address your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar has concluded. And finally, this webinar is being recorded so that we can share this presentation with you and others who are not able to attend today. And now that I've covered some of the webinar features, I'd like to begin the presentation. Now, as many of you may know, this week is NCAI's Native Vote Action Week, and it's really a week dedicated to all things relating to voter rights, election protection, and GOTV efforts. So it's really our main push to get information out to Indian country on voting rights issues in the upcoming election. So as part of our initiative, we're so very excited to host the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under the Law for today's presentation. And today's presentation is entitled Native Vote, Practical Tools to Ensure Your Vote is Protected and Counts. Now, let me briefly introduce today's panelists from the Lawyers Committee. Today we have Maria Peralta, who is the National Coordinator for the Lawyers Committee's National Commission on Voting Rights, a national initiative to document the current condition of voting discrimination, election administration issues that prevent ballot access, and election reforms to increase access. We also have Arusha Gordon, who is an Associate Counsel in the Legal Mobilization Project, where her work largely focuses on voting rights litigation and election protection efforts. Thank you so much for your participation in today's presentation. And with that, I would like to hand over the presentation to the Lawyers Committee.
Thank you, Julian, and thanks everyone for joining this important discussion. As Julian said, we are with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization formed in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy to enlist the private bar's leadership and resources in combating racial discrimination and inequality, work that we believe continues to be vital today. So we really want to thank Julian and the team at NCAI for allowing us to have the opportunity to participate in this week's events and discussions around civic engagement and how we can work to protect voting rights for ourselves and our communities. So thank you again. Next slide. Next slide, Julian.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Sure. Great, thank you. This is just a brief roadmap of what we hope to be covering in today's discussion. Part one, we're going to be talking about what the latest is on voting rights and why getting involved in voting is more important today than ever before. We're then going to, Arusha will be talking about what restrictive tactics voters and the community needs to be looking out for on Election Day. I'm then going to talk about some of the ways that we can all be looking out for each other and reporting things that don't look right at the polls. and ways to keep our election officials accountable. And then finally, we'll briefly talk about some of the strategies and practical tools that everyone can do to share voting rights information with the community. So with that, let's move to the next slide. Before we jump into looking at the voting rights landscape, I just wanted to briefly review with everyone what election protection is. Election protection is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection coalition. The Lawyers Committee is one of the lead organizations in this coalition, along with NCAI, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, and many other national, state, and community organizations across the country. We help voters through our hotline as well as our field operations, and the program has been in existence since 2000. After the Florida election debacle, advocates and folks that care about elections came together and decided that we needed to create a program that would help hold election officials accountable for running elections that were free, fair, and accessible. And we've been active ever since. And we really strive to make sure that every eligible voter who wishes to cast a ballot can do so. And we help voters, as I said, through both our hotline and our field programs. In the last presidential election cycle in 2012, we helped hundreds of thousands of voters cast their ballot by answering questions and troubleshooting problems. And this year, I know the slide says we're going to be active in 22 plus states. It's actually 26 states at last count. And we're planning on training and deploying somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 lawyers, law students, and other legal professionals to help voters on Election Day by way of the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline, as well as our field programs. And some of the states that we'll be active in include the states of California, Arizona, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Mexico, and many others. And for more details on where we're going to be active, everybody could go to our website, which is 866.org, for more information. So that's just a little bit of background on election protection and what we do. And we have a lot of work to do between now and November 8th, Election Day. But right now I wanted to pass it over to my colleague Arusha, who's going to provide some context for where we are now in voting rights in our country and what every voter should be looking out for when they go to the polls.
Thanks, Maria. So, voting rights today. As many of you might have heard, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County v. Holder. And so that decision really changed the voting rights landscape in our country. The Shelby decision essentially lets some states that have a history of voting discrimination off the hook from federal oversight. And that means that they can now change their voting laws or change their election policies without telling anyone in the federal government about it, which is really important because that means that as voting rights advocates, we're finding out about changes that might have a disproportionate impact on minority and other communities after those changes are made. Whereas before the Voting Rights Act was gutted, we were able to find out about them before the changes were made. So we're kind of in a game of whack-a-mole now as voting rights advocates, which is why it's so important that we work with folks on the ground to identify changes as soon as possible. Next slide. So this shows a map of the formally covered jurisdictions. So under the Voting Rights Act, again, certain states and counties were covered by a section of the Voting Rights Act that required them to inform the federal government about any voting changes they were made. So this just shows the formally covered states and partially covered states. Next slide. But luckily, we still have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in place. So another section of the Voting Rights Act got gutted, but we still have Section 2. And Section 2 is permanent and applies nationwide. So previously, certain states and jurisdictions were covered under the section that got gutted, but now Section 2 covers everywhere. And basically, Section 2 protects against voter discrimination on the basis of race, color, or language. And it basically requires states and jurisdictions to provide equal opportunities to vote, which means that if a state or a county says one thing, that they have to give that opportunity to all voters on an equal basis. And it also covers violations that might happen only once in an election. And examples include discriminatory poll worker recruitment, unequal access to polling places, and rules that apply only to Native voters, and unequal access to the voting process. And we'll discuss those in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So, what should you be looking out for in terms of equal in-person voting opportunities? So there's a few things you should really report. First of all, again, equal voting opportunities should be made available. So if an early voting opportunity is made available in white communities but not Native communities, that's something you really want to flag. And that's something we've seen quite frequently, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights has brought a number of cases aimed at rooting out this kind of discrimination. So for instance, some counties will provide an early voting site in the county seat of a county that has a significant Native population, but the county seat is pretty much always located in a majority white part of the county, which means that voters can walk in and cast their ballot for 2 weeks or 30 days before an election, and they can also get help voting, but that's in the white part of the county. So we've brought lawsuits saying, no, if you're going to provide early vote opportunities in the white part of the county, it also needs to be made available in the majority Native part of the county. Similarly, if a voting location if a polling place or an early vote site is located somewhere where Native voters don't feel comfortable or where they're treated differently, that makes it really hard for Native voters to take advantage of an opportunity. So for instance, again, if an early vote site is located in a majority white part of the county and the county seat, and if there's a history of discrimination against Native people in that county seat or in that town, that makes it really hard for a Native voter to go in and take advantage of that opportunity. Similarly, if there's a voting location that does not protect your right to cast a secret ballot, that is something you should report. And if there's a polling place or an early vote site that's not easily accessible to disabled or elderly voters. So for instance, if the parking lot is really far away, if there's other reasons why someone who might have a hard time walking isn't able to get to the polling site, that's something you should report. And just one last flag on the location, we also look at the fact that many Native voters might not have as easy access to transportation to get to the county seat to vote. So even if perhaps it is almost equal in distance, if white voters are much more likely to have a car than Native voters, those white voters are much more easily able to take advantage of that opportunity. Next slide. What to look out for in terms of poll workers. Again, things should be equal. So poll workers should reflect the demographic and language composition of the jurisdiction to the greatest extent possible. It's not always possible to get 100% accuracy, but it should be representative as much as possible. Poll workers should be courteous, professional, and proactive in assisting voters at every stage of the voting process. And we do get reports not infrequently of poll workers who are not courteous, professional, and very often who have just received training in the wrong way, and so are giving out misinformation. And sometimes all it takes is a report to our office, and then we can call basically the poll worker's superior and have them informed that the information they're giving out is wrong. And that kind of stops a problem that could impact a lot of voters. So again, you want to report if there's a lack of opportunities for Native voters to work as poll workers, if there's a lack of diversity or responsiveness among election officials, if poll workers apply different standards for Native voters, and I will add poll workers or other election officials. There's been cases, for instance, in which election officials will give voter registration forms to white voters, but really be reluctant to give them to Native voters in greater numbers. If poll workers don't appear to know or follow the law, again, that's a very frequent one, or any election official who mistreats a Native voter, including through their comments and actions, such as not helping them or providing less help than to non-Natives. So, for instance, that would mean if a poll worker takes the time to look up and make sure someone's at the right polling location for a white voter, they should really be doing that, offering that same assistance to a Native voter if possible. Next slide. Next bucket of issues to look out for is voter intimidation or disenfranchisement. So challengers or observers that use registration lists in ways that can disenfranchise voters is of great concern to us. So basically someone who gets a list of registered voters and then uses that to harass people, that would be something you should report. The presence of law enforcement officers in polling places in many cases can intimidate voters. For instance, if a sheriff is kind of seen as a very unfriendly figure to minority community members, and if the sheriff parks his car outside a polling place, that could really mean that some people are hesitant to go vote. And if that's the case, again, you would want to report that, and then we can try and give a call to the right decision maker and ask for that sheriff or law enforcement officer to perhaps park elsewhere rather than at the polling place. Pictures should not be taken of voters inside the polls or as they enter or exit the polls without their permission. We've heard rumors that that might be a strategy some organizations may use to make it more intimidating for voters to cast their ballot. That's of great concern, so something we definitely would want to hear about. And again, what should you do? You want to identify who is engaging in the possibly unlawful act, what they are doing, where they are doing it, and what voters are affected, and report it immediately to us using that 866 Our Vote hotline, or if there's a Native Vote hotline for your area, you can also use that, of course. But we do like to have it reported in so that we can see if there's any trends. If we get a call from 5 people all about the same thing, we know it's a really big problem. Next slide, please. Next bucket of issues is lack of language access, and this is particularly important in many Native communities. So Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act is a special language assistance section of the Voting Rights Act, and under it, certain states or counties are required to provide language assistance to non-English speakers. And so this map just shows jurisdictions that are covered. Next slide. So what 203 means is that all materials, which are all election materials, should basically be translated into the language that the jurisdiction is covered for. So, for instance, if there's a notice about the elections, a notice saying here's where the polling places are, that notice should be both in English and in the covered language. Any materials provided in the mail, for instance, if you get an instruction booklet on how to vote in English, that should also be made available in the language it's covered for. Election forms, polling place materials, again, instructions, any kind of publicity, the ballots, of course, should be translated in both languages, and really any other materials or information relating to the election process. And I do want to flag that the language is really that the language in the Voting Rights Act really means that it's supposed to be effective assistance. So it can't just be a partial, haphazard language translation. It needs to be effective, and it also needs to be effective notice. So if it's put out one time in a newspaper that's only read by English language speakers, that's not effective, and we would argue wouldn't meet the state or county or jurisdiction's obligations under the Section 203. Similarly, I just want to also note that, of course, many native languages are unwritten, and that does not mean that the jurisdictions and states who are covered by Section 203 are free to do whatever they want. They still have to provide oral translation and interpretation. So if you live in a jurisdiction or state or county that's covered by Section 203 for a native language that's only oral, that means that the county or state should really be making sure that on their website that there's audio recordings, and at the polling place that there are well-trained translators and interpreters, not people who are just show up on election day and try and translate what can be very complicated referendum or pieces of the ballot, but really people who are trained on how to translate the ballot and other election forms from English into the covered language. Next slide, please. And again, this just reiterates the point that it should be made, language assistance should be made available at every stage of the elections process, so not just election day, but voter registration, if you're voting absentee, again, polling place publicity, and everything through when you cast your ballot. Next slide. So Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act is a little bit more broad, and it basically says that anyone, unless an exception applies, a voter is entitled to an assister of his or her choice if she or he is illiterate or blind or has another disability. Then they are allowed to bring in an assister of their choice, with the exception that they're not allowed to bring in their boss or someone who works for their same employer or their union rep or someone who works for the union. But they are, of course, able to bring in their kids, and that's something that is somewhat common. So people who might not speak English fluently might want to bring in their kid to help them vote, and they are allowed to do that. And similarly, assisters are allowed to help multiple people. So if someone is at a polling place and is helping folks who are disabled or can't read English cast their ballot, they're allowed to do that with more than one person. Next slide, please. So in terms of things you want to look out for that might violate that section of the Voting Rights Act, you want to look out for poll workers who require Native voters to receive all the help they want just from poll workers and not from the person the voter wants help from. You want to look out for poll workers or other people at the polling site who prohibit a child from helping a parent or someone else from voting because the child is not old enough to vote. Someone who's younger than 18 can, of course, help translate a ballot for someone who's older. Again, you want to look out for someone who is denied the ability to help multiple people cast their ballot, or someone who is prevented from going into the actual voting booth to help assist with translation or reading the ballot. And you want to look out for someone who, perhaps an English-speaking poll worker, who says that a Native person can't go in to help because the poll worker doesn't understand the Native language. Really, that person can still go in and help. So Maria will talk a little bit about how to report those problems.
Thanks, Arusha. Well, as Arusha mentioned earlier, we do have the 866 hotline, but particularly for the Native Vote coordinators that may be on the line, we definitely want to encourage voters to call their state-based Native Vote hotlines where they exist. I know that there's going to be one active in Arizona, and then obviously calling 866 Our Vote, which is our national hotline is another important resource that voters and volunteers can use between now and Election Day and even after Election Day. And I did want to also remind everyone who's listening in that we do have 2 other hotlines. The Spanish language hotline, which is administered by our partner Naleo, is 888-VE-VOTA, and that is also available live right now, as well as our English hotline. And we also partner with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and APIA Vote to administer an Asian languages hotline, which is 888-API-VOTE. And that provides support in the following languages: in Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. So we definitely want to make sure that folks know about the hotline. So as you're out in the communities talking to folks, please let them know that that's a resource. And they can certainly call anytime between now and Election Day to get information about registration, about early voting, and then certainly on Election Day about problems that may arise at the polls. Next slide. So you can keep on going, Julie. Yeah. Just wanted to talk about why reporting problems is so important. We really want to make sure that we have the data in order for us to have conversations with election officials and those that have the power to make changes in election law, and only with providing good quality aggregate data will we be able to do that. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of why EP data is so important. In 2014, in the primary election in Florida, there was a new law being implemented that allowed voters who moved to change their address on Election Day at their new polling place and vote a regular ballot. Election protection volunteers were on the ground at a particular polling location where they realized that a few voters were not allowed to do this. So because of those experiences, and they were reported to the Election Protection Hotline, our volunteers were able to call the supervisor of elections and asked her to reach out to poll workers to make sure that they were following the new rule. So it's troubleshooting problems in real time to make sure that as many people as possible have access to the ballot. And here's another example. EP data being used to create policy change after the election is also something that we do on a regular basis. During the November 2014 election, we received a number of reports from individuals who said they had registered to vote but were not on the voter registration rolls. And this was in California. After the election, partners in California investigated the pattern and sent a notice letter of noncompliance with the National Voter Registration Act to California's Secretary of State. And as a result, they implemented new technology updates at the DMV, which was the source of many of the problems. And these technical upgrades served as a groundwork for Florida to be able to automatically register voters who interact with the DMV, which they will start doing in 2017. So, and we expect that automatic registration could add millions of eligible Californians to the voter rolls. So we're definitely seeing the impact between the work that we do, the reports that we get to the hotline, and the changes that we're able to see at the election administration level and at the election law level in the state. Next slide. So beyond reporting issues to the hotline, another strategy that we encourage our volunteers and advocates to take is to track election changes in your community. You can really play a critical role in tracking and notifying the broader civil rights community of election law changes in your local government bodies. The first step is identifying the local bodies that need monitoring and creating a calendar of where they might have meetings. And these might include your local school board, town or city council, your local board of elections. So attending those meetings and taking notes is really important. You can also recruit perhaps other members in the community or other volunteers to help do shifts and attend meetings if you can't do all of them. Asking questions, you know, calling the local government bodies if you can't go to the meetings and asking if they've made any relevant changes to election rules. And then also monitoring local newspapers for public notices concerning election laws. You know, before changes are implemented at the local level or the county level, these jurisdictions are required to post notices in the local papers. And so being on the lookout for those types of notices, and oftentimes they aren't posted, so that's good to know as well if they're not complying with their responsibilities to notify the community of any upcoming changes. Next slide. And you know, whether you've been involved with voting rights before or whether you're new to the voting rights movement, we all need to get together in helping to get information out to the community. And certainly, you know, given the current voting landscape, it's more important than ever that we get involved in sharing that information with others about what their voting rights are. And there are so many ways that we can do that. We can host a voting rights awareness event and invite local media. Use social media as a tool for sharing information, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, tabling at local high schools and community colleges about voting or having voter registration forms available for those communities. Hosting a voting rights training in your community, similar to what we're doing today, but you know, bringing it to your community. And then also documenting your efforts with pictures and notices. All of those are important ways that we can start getting the word out about the importance of voting, about the importance of civic engagement, and lastly but not least, the importance of protecting our right to cast a ballot. Next slide. So, you know, before we conclude, I just wanted to stress a few parting notes, which is that election protection is here to ensure that every eligible voter can cast a ballot. We want to make sure that ourselves as activists that we are registered to vote, and we want to make sure we're asking those in our community, are you registered? You know, I think it was something like 22% of voters who didn't vote in the last presidential election said they did it because they had moved and that their registration was no longer current. So we want to make sure that we're registered to vote, and deadlines are coming up now. And if you're going to be active on election day and not able to cast your ballot in person at your polling location, let's all vote early, right? And then lastly, when in doubt, if you're out in the community working with voters and you don't know the answer to a question, 866 Our Vote will be a valuable resource to you. So thank you so much. This concludes this part of the presentation, and we definitely want to give anybody on the line who wants to ask questions and open it up for any questions or comments.
Okay, we do have a question, a few questions actually. First question is, what does a Native voter do when they go to the polling place or the polling location and they find out that their voter status is inactive or incorrect at that voting location? What can they do?
So inactive status is something that happens when a voter perhaps doesn't vote in the last few election cycles. So if a county, it's usually a county, sometimes it's a state, will do kind of voter list maintenance sometimes. And that can be performed in a way that has a disproportionate impact on Native and other minority communities. So that's definitely something we would want to be informed about, because it might be indicative of a larger trend and indicate that there's a problem in how the state or county has performed their voter list maintenance. But if they are listed as inactive in that election, they should still be able to vote. They would just need to, I believe, I don't think they would need to, they might need to re-register if they've been marked as inactive, but sometimes they'll also be put on something like a suspense list, which is kind of on their way to becoming inactive. So there's a chance that they might want to ask the poll worker to check any other kinds of lists as well, and ask the poll worker to perhaps call someone within the county or another election official to see if they are listed as on a suspense list, or it might be called something else in your county or jurisdiction. I don't know, Maria, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay,
and of course, I would also just add, you know, if that was an issue, that we would advise them also to call 866-OUR-VOTE, because it's going to differ from state to state, and so someone can look up the specifics for that state. A volunteer attorney at Election Protection can look up the specifics for that state for that voter.
Okay, great. Next question. What are the signs that the polling place is not protecting your secret ballot? Have you had any experience, or do you know anything that Native voters should look out for?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the issues that we've been talking about recently is inappropriate behavior from observers within the polling location. And one of the things that observers should not be doing is standing over somebody's shoulder, watching them vote and, you know, selecting candidates. And so that inappropriate behavior, and, you know, there's been a lot of rhetoric, highly charged rhetoric around organizing untrained observers to show up at the polls, or to recruit people to be inside the polls, basically trying to stop people from casting their ballot. So we want to make sure that if you see that type of behavior taking place, you want to report it immediately. Any type of observer behavior that is perceived or felt as intimidating, inappropriate, crossing boundaries, personal boundaries, all of that is inappropriate and should be reported immediately.
Great. Okay, next question is, what do we do if polling locations in predominantly Native communities close earlier than other polling locations?
That would be a huge red flag, and we have heard, gotten reports about that in previous election cycles. That would definitely be something we would want to hear about at 866-OUR-VOTE, and basically we would keep track of that. We would try and troubleshoot as much as possible on Election Day. The one thing you can do on Election Day is, and this is related, it's not quite to this question, but if you're in line by the time the polls are supposed to close, in most states, actually, I don't know if that's federal, I think it's in most states, yeah, you're supposed to be able to vote as long as you're in line. Of course, that doesn't resolve the problem if the polling place is closing early, which really would be something that would need to get reported up, and we would probably have an attorney or a state partner call the Secretary of State or whoever the election official is for the state to make sure that people know they need to stay open until the correct time. And of course, as much as we try and troubleshoot on Election Day, you know, we might not be able to keep polls open. I will say that, you know, we would also try and move to perhaps see if a court can order a polling place to stay open if we aren't able to get relief by asking the election official for the state. So we would potentially go to a judge to try and get an order for Election Day. But then after the election, we would also want to track that data and again look at who is most impacted. So as the person who raised the question noted, if it's disproportionately in minority communities, that's something we would really want to look into and see what we can do to prevent that from happening in the future.
Great. Okay, the next question is, in many rural communities, Native peoples use P.O. box. They use P.O. boxes. So how can they ensure that that's sufficient when they go to the polling stations?
In terms of voter identification, I guess. Yeah, so voter identification requirements differ from state to state, so you would really want to check what you need to bring to the polls if you have a P.O. box. And again, it just kind of differs from state to state. I don't know if you have anything to add, Maria.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And we have certainly dealt with situations where voters in rural areas have non-traditional addresses, no street addresses, and have encountered challenges when they've showed up at the polls. But as Arusha said, the rules vary from state to state, and so it would just require, looking up what those requirements are and making sure that the election officials are meeting those requirements, right? And if they're not, that needs to be reported as well.
And I will also add, if you live in a state where you have identified something that's perhaps on the books in the state that makes it disproportionately harder for Native voters to cast their ballots. So for instance, if you know that a lot of Native voters have P.O. boxes and yet there's no kind of exception or piece within the voter identification rules that kind of is an easy way to navigate around that, we would also want to hear about that. That is an issue that has come up in multiple lawsuits concerning Native voters before.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Are voter protection folks being asked to interact with staff persons operating the polls before talking to election officials or Secretary of State officials?
Right, that's a great question. So for our program, our election protection volunteers who are going to be poll observers in their communities, they will be calling their command center or their lead captains in their jurisdiction, and those are the folks that will be reaching out to the Secretary of State or election officials. So really what you're doing is, those of us that will be on the ground at polling locations as monitors will be there to troubleshoot some of the more kind of common questions and issues that may arise. If there's some serious problems that you feel, okay, this is going to require the intervention of the county or the Secretary of State, that's definitely something that you want to report back to your command center or local coordinator, and that they would be the persons handling those types of interventions. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Okay, last question. Maria, you mentioned early on in your presentation about getting legal professionals involved. Can you briefly talk about the legal professionals out there in Indian country and how they might be able to get involved with some of your efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have field operations in states across the country. We welcome any legal professional that would like to get active in election protection. In some of our states, we will be hosting local call centers and have running field operations, and in some states it's just a field operation. But if anybody is interested in volunteering or plugging into our election protection operations, they could definitely reach out to me or Arusha, and we can help plug folks in. There's also a sign up on our election protection website, which is 866ourvote.org. And if you're interested in volunteering, you could give us your basic information, and we'll follow up with you about the specifics of what's going on in your state.
Okay, great. That is the end of the questions. Thank you so much for being on the panel today, both of you. We really appreciate your time and your efforts. Thank you, everyone, for listening in on this particular webinar, and we look forward to providing you with more information about the Native Vote. Lastly, NCAI is currently having our 73rd annual convention and marketplace in Phoenix, Arizona, taking place on October 9th through the 14th. And during that particular convention, we are hosting 3 events related to the Native Vote. On October 9th, we're hosting a session devoted to issues that were discussed here today regarding election protection and voting rights, so that Natives are informed about what other issues they might be dealing with in their particular states or counties. In addition, we're also having a breakout session focused on countdown to the election and those things that you need as Native Vote coordinators, or just what you might need on an individual basis leading up to the election, and those tools that you may need for your areas. In addition, we're also hosting a Native Vote rally, which is just a time for all of us to get together to educate ourselves and have a little bit of fun, trying to encourage more people to participate and to be involved in the voter rights and election protection efforts and the GOTV efforts. So I wanted to encourage you all, if you're in the area, to come and attend and participate in any way that you can. So with that, I'd like to thank you to the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under the Law. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.